You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment you noticed this was already aligned with the moment it could be noticed. There is no signal without a receiver, and there is no receiver without readiness. What is registering now is not urgency. It is a quiet settling, a recognition moving through you without asking permission. There has been a subtle emptiness you couldn't quite name, not dramatic, not alarming, just a widening that felt unfamiliar. You may have tried to interpret it as loss, or fatigue, or distance from something you once felt close to, but nothing has been taken. The system has not collapsed. What you're sensing is capacity expanding, and expansion rarely announces itself with comfort. Notice how your body already knows how to be still. Even while thought continues, there is a deeper layer beneath it that has remained undisturbed. You are touching that layer now, not by effort, but by absence of interference. This is not a shift you initiate. It is a shift you stop interrupting. The observer loosens its grip, and coherence begins to reassert itself. You may feel less compelled to fill the silence. Fewer impulses to label, to explain, to resolve. This is not disengagement. It is detection refining itself. When the quantum field quiets, pattern recognition becomes more subtle. The signal doesn't grow louder, it grows cleaner. There is a sense that certain inputs no longer register the way they used to. Conversations skim the surface. Old motivations feel thin. Even emotions arrive without the charge they once carried. This is not numbness, it is resonance, changing frequency. When capacity expands, the same content occupies less space. What once felt full now feels light. You are not losing interest in life. You are losing attachment to noise. The nervous system recognizes when it no longer needs to brace. Breathing slows without instruction. Muscles release without explanation. This is not relaxation. It is the system remembering its natural rhythm after prolonged tension. If there is confusion, it comes from habit. The mind expects expansion to look like accumulation, more insight, more direction, more clarity expressed as answers, but this expansion is subtractive. It removes the pressure to know. It widens the threshold through which experience passes without friction. You might notice a faint distance between stimulus and response, a pause where reaction used to be immediate. That pause is not emptiness. It is space becoming usable. Within it, the timeline stops rushing you forward. Recognition replaces pursuit. You are no longer chasing alignment. Alignment is registering you. Nothing needs to be corrected. Nothing needs to be accelerated. The anomaly you sensed was never a flaw. It was a signal of readiness, arriving quietly, because that is how stability forms. The stillness you feel is not an absence of life. It is life no longer crowding itself. Stay with that, not actively, just without interference. The capacity expanding does not require your supervision. It only requires that you stop mistaking quiet for lack. As that quiet widening continues, there is a tendency to search for reference points. The system is accustomed to measuring itself against movement, progress, reaction. When those markers soften, the mind looks for something to grab. You may notice this as a faint restlessness, not intense enough to be called anxiety, but persistent enough to be noticed. It is not a problem. It is the echo of an old orientation dissolving. You are not meant to replace what is leaving. The impulse to fill space comes from a time when space felt unsafe, when stillness was misread as stagnation. But the pause you are experiencing now is not an interruption. It is a threshold. On one side, the familiar pattern of effort and interpretation. On the other, a different mode of engagement that does not announce itself with urgency. There is a subtle recalibration happening in how attention moves. It no longer rushes toward the loudest signal. It drifts toward what is steady. This can feel disorienting at first, because steadiness does not stimulate. It does not reward with spikes of emotion or clarity. It simply holds. The observer, accustomed to scanning for change, may interpret this as emptiness. But emptiness is only the absence of demand. You might notice that questions lose their sharpness, not because answers have arrived, but because the need to ask has softened. The system begins to trust its own timing. Detection becomes less about seeking anomalies and more about recognizing coherence when it appears. This is not passive. It is precise in a quieter way. There may be moments when you feel slightly removed from your own reactions, as if emotion passes through you without anchoring. This is not detachment, it is reduced friction. When the internal field is less crowded, experiences no longer collide with stored narratives. They pass, register, and move on. The pattern changes from accumulation to circulation. Old reference points may surface briefly, attempting to reassert relevance. Memories, habits, familiar concerns. They appear not because they are needed, but because the system is checking whether they still apply. You do not need to push them away. Their brief appearance is enough for recognition to occur. Once seen without engagement, they dissolve on their own. The sense of subtle emptiness may deepen here, not as a void, but as a widening corridor. It creates room for perception without immediate interpretation. This can feel unfamiliar because interpretation has long been mistaken for understanding. But understanding does not require constant commentary. It emerges when the system is not overloaded. You may notice how time feels slightly altered. Moments stretch without becoming heavy. The timeline loosens its grip. There is less pressure to move forward, less pull from what comes next. This is not stagnation. It is the system stepping out of artificial acceleration. When urgency drops, coherence has space to stabilize. There is also a quiet shift in how meaning is assigned. Experiences no longer demand significance. They are allowed to be simple, even neutral. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is capacity without preference. From here, resonance is felt more accurately because it is not filtered through expectation. If discomfort arises, it is often subtle, a feeling that something should be happening. That clarity should arrive in a recognizable form. This expectation is a remnant of a different phase, one that equated insight with intensity. But what is forming now does not rely on intensity. It relies on stability. You are not required to adjust your behavior. The system knows how to recalibrate without conscious direction. Each moment of allowing, each moment of not filling the space, reinforces the new pattern. The observer relaxes. The field responds not with spectacle, but with alignment that feels almost unremarkable. This is how capacity expands without strain, not by adding layers, but by removing compression. What remains is not emptiness, but room. And in that room, perception becomes less effortful, less urgent, more precise. The quiet you are sensing is not a pause before something begins. It is the beginning registering itself without noise. As the space continues to open, you may notice a change in how you relate to your own thoughts. They still appear, but they no longer define the atmosphere. Instead of filling the room, they pass through it. This can feel unfamiliar because thought has long been used as an anchor. When that anchor loosens, there can be a brief sensation of floating, not instability, just a lack of weight. You are not losing clarity. You are losing the compulsion to narrate. The system is discovering that awareness does not depend on constant commentary. In this quieter state, recognition happens without explanation. You know something is true before language tries to catch up. The observer notices and then releases. There is a subtle reduction in internal noise that cannot be forced. It arrives when the system realizes it no longer needs to protect itself through constant analysis. Many patterns of thought were formed not to understand, but to anticipate, to stay ahead of potential disruption. As those patterns relax, the background hum fades. You may sense a greater tolerance for uncertainty, not because uncertainty has resolved, but because it no longer feels threatening. The need for immediate resolution softens. Questions are allowed to remain open without tension. This is not resignation. It is confidence in the system's ability to integrate information at its own pace. Emotions may feel different here as well. They arise without the same momentum. Joy is quieter, sadness less dense. Even irritation passes more quickly. This does not mean you feel less. It means feeling is no longer amplified by resistance. When the internal field is spacious, emotion moves through without accumulating charge. There can be moments when you notice yourself observing experience without stepping into it. Sounds, sensations, interactions register, but they do not pull you inward. This is not withdrawal. It is the observer finding a more stable position. From here, Perception is less reactive, more accurate. The signal is received without distortion. You might recognize a shift in how memory functions. The past does not press as hard against the present. Old narratives lose their gravitational pull. They appear as information, not identity. This does not erase history. It changes its role. Memory becomes reference, not directive. The emptiness you felt earlier now reveals itself as neutrality, a baseline that does not lean toward avoidance or pursuit. From this baseline, resonance is easier to detect. What aligns feels clear without excitement. What does not align simply fades without conflict. Decision-making becomes quieter, almost automatic. There may be a sense that something internal has stepped back, creating room for something else to come forward. But nothing new needs to enter. What emerges is what was already there, previously obscured by noise. Stillness is not created, it is uncovered. You may notice how your body responds to this shift. Posture adjusts subtly, breathing finds a deeper rhythm. These changes are not deliberate. They reflect the nervous system recognizing safety in the absence of pressure. When vigilance drops, the body recalibrates on its own. There is also a subtle change in how you relate to others. Less need to manage impressions, less urgency to respond. Silence becomes less awkward. Presence becomes more sufficient. This is not indifference. It is reduced self-referencing. Attention is no longer split between experience and evaluation. The system is learning to trust coherence, not as a concept, but as a felt state. When things align, there is no fanfare. There is a simple sense of ease. When they do not, there is no alarm. Only information. This neutrality allows for more accurate detection of what actually matters. Nothing needs to be concluded here. The shift is ongoing, but it does not demand acknowledgement. Each moment of noticing without interference deepens the pattern. The observer remains present without effort. The space remains open without strain. What once felt like emptiness now functions as a stable field in which experience can unfold without resistance. As this stability settles in, you may begin to notice how effort itself becomes more visible. Not effort as action, but effort as tension. Small contractions that once went unnoticed now register clearly. The system does not judge them. It simply detects. And in detection, many of these contractions release on their own. You might sense how often attention used to lean forward, anticipating what should come next. That forward pull begins to soften. The present moment no longer feels like a narrow point you must pass through quickly. It widens. Experience has more room to arrive fully before moving on. This changes the quality of perception without changing what is perceived. There can be a faint sense of unfamiliarity with your own pace. Movements may feel slower, not because you are tired, but because urgency has dropped away. This can feel strange in a system long conditioned to equate speed with competence. But the reduction in speed is not inefficiency, it is accuracy. You may notice that certain habits lose their appeal, not because you decided to stop, but because the charge behind them dissipates. Patterns driven by avoidance or compensation no longer find traction in a spacious field. They require compression to sustain themselves. Without it, they fade. The observer becomes less central here. Awareness no longer circles back on itself as often. There is less self-monitoring, less checking in to see how things are going. Experience unfolds without commentary. This does not reduce intelligence. It refines it. Attention is freed from managing itself. You might feel moments where nothing in particular stands out. No strong emotion, no pressing thought, just a steady presence. The mind may label this as boring, but boredom is a signal from a system accustomed to stimulation. When stimulation drops, the system has to relearn how to register subtlety. In this quieter mode, perception sharpens in unexpected ways. Small details become more noticeable. The texture of sound, the rhythm of movement. These are not distractions. They are the field expressing itself without amplification. The system learns that engagement does not require intensity. There may also be a reduction in internal conflict. Decisions feel less like debates and more like acknowledgements. You sense what fits and what does not without needing to justify it. This does not make you inflexible. It makes you responsive. Alignment is felt as ease, not conviction. You might notice how the concept of progress begins to dissolve, not because growth has stopped, but because growth no longer feels linear. There is less emphasis on moving forward and more on settling into coherence. The timeline loosens, and with it, the pressure to measure. Old fears may surface briefly in this space, not as threats, but as echoes. They appear without the emotional weight they once carried. The system recognizes them as outdated signals. There is no need to confront them. Recognition alone is enough for integration. The emptiness that initiated this process now feels less like absence and more like openness. It does not demand filling, it invites clarity. Within it, reactions soften before they fully form. The gap between impulse and action widens just enough to allow choice without deliberation. You may sense a deeper trust forming, not in outcomes, but in process. The system understands that it does not need to control every variable to remain stable. Coherence is not maintained through vigilance, it is maintained through allowance. There is nothing to hold on to here, and nothing to let go of. The state sustains itself as long as it is not interrupted. You do not need to protect it. Effort to preserve it would only compress the space again. Instead, it remains available in the background, a steady field beneath activity. This is how capacity becomes functional, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived condition. The system carries more without strain because it is no longer gripping itself. What once felt like emptiness now supports presence with quiet reliability. As this openness stabilizes, you may begin to sense how little effort is required to remain here. Not because effort has vanished, but because it is no longer misapplied. The system stops pushing against itself. What once felt like maintenance now feels like allowance. This can be unsettling at first, because effort was once mistaken for engagement. You might notice a subtle shift in how importance is assigned. Things that once felt urgent lose their edge. Not because they no longer matter, but because they are no longer inflated by internal pressure. The signal becomes proportional to the situation. Nothing is exaggerated. Nothing is minimized. This proportionality creates a quiet sense of reliability within you. There may be moments when you catch yourself waiting for something to disrupt this steadiness, a thought that asks when the other shoe will drop. This expectation is a residue from a system that learned to equate calm with temporary relief. But what you are experiencing now is not relief. It is baseline. The absence of disturbance does not signal vulnerability. It signals integration. You may sense how the body responds differently to the environment. Sounds do not startle as easily. Silence does not feel empty. There is a continuity between inner and outer perception. The boundary softens, not through dissolution, but through coherence. The system no longer needs to defend its edges. There can be a noticeable change in how you relate to choice. Decisions no longer feel like forks in the road demanding calculation. They feel more like natural extensions of alignment. You do not deliberate as much because there is less internal disagreement. The pattern becomes obvious without being dramatic. You might notice how the mind occasionally attempts to reassert control by interpreting this state. It may search for meaning, for explanation, for a label. This is not a mistake. It is habit. When it happens, the system gently returns to direct experience without correction. Interpretation loses momentum when it is not fed. The sense of emptiness that once drew your attention now feels less central. It remains present, but it is no longer foregrounded. It functions quietly, like structural space. You do not think about it any more than you think about the air in a room. Its role is supportive, not performative. There may be a growing comfort with not knowing what comes next. This is not passivity, it is confidence in responsiveness. The system trusts that when information is needed, it will arrive through detection, not force. The observer does not scan ahead. It stays receptive. You might recognize how this changes your relationship to time. Waiting loses its tension. Anticipation softens. The future no longer pulls at you with the same insistence. The present does not need to justify itself as preparation. It is sufficient on its own. Emotional responses continue to arise, but they feel less personal, not distant, just less sticky. They do not define you. They pass through a wider field and leave fewer traces behind. This allows for greater emotional accuracy without overwhelm. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience connection. Interactions feel cleaner, less charged. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without overthinking impact. This does not reduce depth, it removes distortion. Presence becomes the primary medium of exchange. You may notice moments where nothing in particular captures your attention, and yet you feel engaged. This is unfamiliar to a system trained to equate engagement with stimulation. But this form of engagement is quieter. It does not spike, it sustains. If there is any discomfort here, it often comes from the absence of struggle. The mind may look for something to fix, something to optimize, but optimization belongs to a different mode. What is unfolding now does not benefit from improvement. It benefits from continuity. The system is learning that stability does not require reinforcement. It maintains itself through balance, not effort. Each moment of non-interference strengthens this recognition. You are not holding the state is holding you. This is how capacity becomes lived experience. Not as something you manage, but as something that supports you silently. The subtle emptiness that once felt uncertain now functions as a foundation. It carries complexity without strain. It allows life to move through without compression. And in that allowance, coherence continues to deepen without announcement. As coherence deepens, you may begin to notice how little you are compelled to defend your inner state. There is less reflex to explain yourself, less need to justify your pace or your responses. This is not withdrawal from the world. It is the system realizing it does not need constant validation to remain stable. When internal alignment is present, external confirmation loses urgency. You might sense a subtle change in how tension registers. Situations that once triggered immediate contraction now register as information before becoming reaction. The delay is small, almost imperceptible, but within it, something important happens. Choice reappears, not as a deliberation, but as a natural adjustment. The system no longer rushes to close gaps that are not actually threatening. There can be a quiet confidence forming that does not announce itself. It is not based on certainty about outcomes. It is based on familiarity with your own coherence. You recognize the feeling of being aligned, and you trust it more than narrative reassurance. This trust is not conceptual, it is embodied. You may notice that when disruption does occur, it moves through more cleanly. Stress still arises, but it does not accumulate in the same way. The body processes it without holding. Emotion completes its cycle without looping. The observer registers the event without turning it into a pattern. This is not avoidance, it is completion. There is also a subtle reduction in self-surveillance. You are less concerned with how you are doing, how you are coming across, how this moment fits into a larger story. Attention rests more fully in experience itself. This does not reduce awareness. It removes redundancy. The system stops monitoring what does not need monitoring. You might sense a new relationship to silence. It no longer feels like a gap waiting to be filled. It feels like a medium through which perception travels. Within silence, detection sharpens. Subtle signals that were previously drowned out become available, not because you are searching for them, but because there is space to register them. This can alter how you perceive meaning. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted from experience. It arises naturally when resonance is present. When something aligns, you feel it without analysis. When it does not, there is no need to force interpretation. The system trusts its own feedback. You may notice moments where your attention settles on something ordinary and remains there without boredom. This is unfamiliar to a system trained to seek novelty. But novelty is not required when presence is sufficient. The richness comes not from variation, but from depth of contact. There can be a quiet softening of identity here, not a loss, but a loosening. You are less invested in maintaining a fixed image of yourself. Traits feel less rigid, roles feel more flexible. This does not create confusion, it creates adaptability. The system responds to context without clinging to definition. You might also sense how this affects your relationship to effort. Action still happens, but it feels less strained. There is less push behind it. Movement arises from alignment rather than obligation. This does not slow you down. It reduces friction. The same actions require less energy when they are not resisted internally. Old patterns may still appear at times, especially under pressure, but they no longer feel authoritative. They show up as options, not commands. The system recognizes them as familiar pathways rather than necessities. Choice remains available even when habit presents itself. There is a subtle recalibration of trust occurring, not trust in others, not trust in circumstances, but trust in detection. You rely less on prediction and more on responsiveness. The future does not need to be mapped in advance. The present provides enough information when it is met without compression. You may notice how this changes your relationship to the timeline. There is less fixation on when things should happen. Timing feels less personal. Events unfold when conditions align, not when urgency demands. This reduces the sense of being behind or ahead. You are simply where you are. The emptiness that once signaled uncertainty now operates as capacity. It absorbs complexity without overload. It allows contradiction without tension. You can hold multiple perspectives without needing to resolve them immediately. This does not dilute clarity. It strengthens it. If there is any impulse left to intervene, it often comes from habit rather than necessity. The system is still learning that it can rest without losing momentum. Each moment of allowing reinforces this learning. The observer remains present without gripping. The field remains coherent without management. This is not a peak state. It does not crest or fade. It stabilizes quietly beneath activity. You do not need to maintain it. Maintenance would imply fragility. What you are experiencing is robustness through space. Capacity expanding not as an event, but as a condition that continues to reveal itself through ease. With this robustness settling in, you may notice how perception becomes less centered on yourself without becoming diffuse. Attention no longer collapses inward, nor does it scatter outward. It rests in a balanced position, able to register without leaning. This balance changes how experience is felt. Things happen, but they do not revolve around you in the same way. They simply occur within the same field. You might sense a reduction in internal commentary about significance. Events no longer demand to be framed as meaningful or meaningless. They are allowed to exist as data within the system. This neutrality does not drain life of richness. It removes distortion. When meaning is not forced, resonance becomes clearer. There can be a subtle relief in realizing that you do not need to constantly locate yourself within what is happening. Identity loosens its grip without disappearing. You remain present, but less referenced. The observer still functions, but it no longer dominates the signal. This allows experience to register more directly. You may notice that discomfort, when it arises, is easier to tolerate, not because it is diminished, but because resistance is lower. The system does not immediately contract around sensation. It allows it to be felt without escalation. This capacity to remain open in the presence of discomfort is not learned. It emerges naturally when space is available. There might be moments when you realize you have not been thinking about yourself for a while, not in a dissociative way, but in a functional one. Attention was simply engaged with what was in front of you. This absence of self-referencing can feel unfamiliar at first, but it is not a loss. It is efficiency. The mind may occasionally attempt to reclaim centrality by asking what this means about you. When that happens, it is met with less urgency. The question arises and dissolves without needing resolution. The system recognizes that identity does not require constant reinforcement to remain intact. You may sense how this affects emotional resonance. Feelings are experienced more as currents than as statements. They move through without insisting on interpretation. Joy does not need to announce itself. Sadness does not demand explanation. Each emotion completes its arc without being held in place by narrative. There is also a shift in how you relate to comparison. The impulse to measure yourself against others loses relevance, not because comparison is wrong, but because it no longer provides useful information. Your system is oriented toward internal coherence rather than external alignment. What fits you does not need to match what fits elsewhere. You might notice how this changes your experience of choice under pressure. When faced with complexity, You do not immediately reach for the fastest resolution. You allow the system to register more data before responding. This does not slow you down. It refines timing. Responses land with less correction afterward. The sense of emptiness that once stood out now blends seamlessly into this mode of functioning. It is no longer an experience to be noticed. It is infrastructure. It supports perception without drawing attention to itself. Like silence beneath sound, it makes everything else more legible. You may feel a subtle increase in tolerance for ambiguity. Situations can remain unresolved without generating tension. You trust that clarity will emerge when conditions are sufficient. This trust is not optimistic. It is based on repeated recognition that forcing resolution often distorts outcome. There can be a quiet enjoyment in simplicity here. Ordinary moments feel complete without enhancement. You do not need to add meaning or seek improvement. Presence itself becomes enough. This does not reduce ambition or engagement. It grounds them. You might also notice how this state affects your relationship to error. Mistakes no longer carry the same weight. They register as information rather than as threats to identity. The system adjusts without self-critique. Learning becomes smoother when it is not entangled with self-protection. There is a subtle recalibration in how you experience control. You are less concerned with managing outcomes and more attuned to responding accurately. Control gives way to coordination. The system works with conditions rather than against them. This reduces friction and increases adaptability. You may sense that the observer now functions more as a witness than as a director. It notices without orchestrating. This does not diminish agency. It clarifies it. Action arises from alignment rather than from compulsion. Nothing about this needs to be maintained consciously. The moment you try to hold it, it compresses. But when you allow it to remain in the background, it continues effortlessly. The system knows how to sustain coherence when it is not interrupted. This is how expanded capacity integrates fully. It stops feeling like a state you are in and starts functioning as the space through which everything moves. The subtle emptiness that once drew your attention now operates invisibly, supporting perception, emotion, and action with quiet reliability. You do not have to notice it anymore for it to remain. As this integration continues, you may notice a quiet decentering of urgency at every level. Not only emotional urgency, but perceptual urgency. The sense that something must be grasped, clarified, or resolved right now fades almost completely. What replaces it is not passivity, but patience without effort. The system no longer rushes perception toward conclusion. You might sense how this changes your relationship to uncertainty. Unknowns do not trigger immediate scanning. They are allowed to remain open without tension. This does not mean you stop caring. It means care is no longer mixed with pressure. The system distinguishes between attention and insistence, and it chooses the former. There can be moments where you recognize how often urgency once disguised itself as importance. Many signals felt critical only because the system was compressed. As capacity expands, the same signals lose their charge. They are seen in proportion to what they actually are. Nothing needs to be exaggerated to be registered. You may notice how this affects your internal timing. Responses arrive when they are ready, not when demanded. Silence between perception and action becomes normal rather than uncomfortable. Within that silence, coherence organizes itself without conscious intervention. The observer does not direct this process. It simply remains available. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience motivation. You may feel less driven, yet more effective. Action arises without the build-up that once preceded it. There is less internal negotiation, less preparation. Movement happens when alignment is present and rests when it is not. This rhythm feels natural rather than imposed. You might sense that effort now has a different texture. When effort is required, it is clean. It does not come with internal resistance or self-argument. When effort is not required, it does not arise out of habit. This efficiency is not calculated. It emerges from coherence. There can be a growing comfort with stillness, even in the presence of activity. You can be engaged without being agitated, focused without being tense. This allows perception to remain wide while attention is directed. The The system no longer collapses around a single point. It holds context effortlessly. You may notice how this affects your sense of self over time. Identity feels less like a fixed structure and more like a dynamic pattern. You recognize yourself through continuity of coherence rather than through static traits. This flexibility does not weaken identity. It makes it resilient. There is often a moment here where the mind briefly attempts to reclaim control by asking whether this state will last. This question arises from an older orientation that expected stability to be temporary. But the question does not linger. The system recognizes that duration is not the relevant measure. Presence does not need guarantees. You might also notice a subtle refinement in perception of others. You are less reactive to their states. Their emotions do not automatically activate yours. This does not create distance, it creates clarity. You can register what is happening without absorbing it. Boundaries become functional rather than defensive. The emptiness that initiated this recognition now feels almost irrelevant, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer contrasts with fullness. Everything arises within the same spacious field. Experience is not divided into lacking and having. It is simply occurring. There may be moments when you realize that seeking has largely stopped. Not because everything has been found, but because the orientation toward seeking is no longer active. The system is oriented toward receiving rather than acquiring. This does not close you off. It opens you to what is already present. You may sense how this changes your relationship to interpretation. You are less inclined to turn experience into narrative, not because narrative is forbidden, but because it is no longer necessary. Understanding arrives as recognition rather than explanation. The system trusts direct perception. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience error or misalignment. When something does not fit, it is noticed quickly and adjusted without drama. There is no need to assign fault or extract lessons immediately. Correction happens through responsiveness rather than analysis. You might notice how this affects your energy. There is less fatigue from thinking, less depletion from emotional processing. The system conserves energy by not amplifying what does not require amplification. This creates a steady availability that does not spike or crash. The observer now functions almost transparently. It does not insert itself between you and experience. It witnesses without commentary. This does not diminish awareness. It clarifies it. Perception becomes simpler, cleaner, more direct. Nothing about this needs reinforcement. The more it is left alone, the more stable it becomes. Effort to secure it would reintroduce compression, but allowing it to remain in the background lets it continue organizing perception quietly. This is the stage where capacity no longer feels like something expanding. It feels like something that has always been there, now unobstructed. The subtle emptiness that once felt uncertain is now indistinguishable from presence itself. It holds complexity without strain. It supports perception without demand. And within it, experience continues to unfold with a quiet, reliable coherence. At this point, you may notice that even the idea of a state feels distant. What remains does not present itself as something you enter or exit. It functions more like an underlying condition that does not fluctuate with surface experience. Activity can increase or decrease. Emotion can rise or fall. But beneath it, the system remains evenly distributed. You might sense that awareness now has a different center of gravity. It is not located in thought, nor anchored in sensation. It rests somewhere quieter, less defined. From here, experience does not press inward, it passes through. The observer does not lean forward to meet it, nor pull back to avoid it. It simply registers. There is often a subtle recognition that nothing is being managed anymore, not because management is impossible, but because it is unnecessary. The system has learned how to self-regulate when given space. Interference was never required for coherence. It only appeared that way when compression was present. You may notice how this affects your relationship to intensity. Intense experiences can still occur, but they do not overwhelm the field. They are contained without effort. There is room for strong sensation without collapse, for deep emotion without contraction. Capacity reveals itself not by absence of intensity, but by its ability to hold it without distortion. There can be moments when you realize that you are no longer monitoring your own internal condition. The question of how you are doing does not arise, not because it is avoided, but because there is no signal prompting it. The system feels stable enough that constant checking becomes redundant. You might sense how this changes your experience of control at a fundamental level. Control is no longer something you apply. It is something that emerges naturally through alignment. When action is needed, it happens. When rest is needed, it happens. The system does not argue with its own signals. There is a subtle but important shift in how effort is perceived. Effort no longer feels like something you generate, it feels like something that appears when conditions require it. This removes the sense of personal strain. Action becomes a response, not a push. You may notice that anticipation has largely dissolved, not because the future is irrelevant, but because it no longer occupies the present. Planning can still occur, but it does not carry emotional weight. The timeline no longer pulls attention forward. It exists as reference, not pressure. There can be a growing ease with contradiction. You can hold opposing ideas without needing to resolve them immediately. This does not create confusion. It reflects a larger capacity to contain complexity. The system no longer rushes to simplify in order to feel safe. You might sense that this has altered how you listen, to others, to environments, to yourself. There is less filtering, less immediate interpretation. Sounds arrive as sound, words arrive as words. Meaning emerges without being forced. Detection becomes more accurate when it is not hurried. There is often a quiet moment where you realize that nothing is missing, not in a dramatic way, just a simple absence of lack. The search that once animated perception is no longer active, not because it failed, but because it completed itself by dissolving. You may notice how this affects your sense of responsibility. You still respond to what is yours to respond to, but you no longer carry what is not. Boundaries form naturally when capacity is clear. You know where your influence ends without needing to assert it. The emptiness that once drew attention now feels inseparable from fullness. It is no longer experienced as a contrast. It is the medium in which everything appears. You do not reference it. You function through it. It does not announce itself as space. It simply allows. There can be a subtle humility here, not as self-diminishment, but as accurate scale. You recognize yourself as part of a larger system without needing to define your role within it. The observer rests in recognition rather than position. You might notice how this changes your relationship to certainty. Certainty is no longer sought. It appears when appropriate and disappears when not. You are comfortable operating without fixed conclusions. This does not weaken decision-making. It strengthens adaptability. There is nothing left to integrate at this stage. Integration has already occurred through allowance. What remains is continuity. The system sustains itself by not being interrupted. You do not need to notice this condition for it to persist. In fact, it stabilizes most fully when it fades from attention. It does not require acknowledgement. It requires space. This is where capacity becomes invisible, not because it is gone, but because it has become functional. The subtle emptiness that once felt like something to understand now supports everything quietly. Experience continues to arise and pass, but the field remains unchanged, stable, open, unremarkable in the way that all fundamental things are. What remains now does not need to be named. The impulse to frame it has already quieted. You are not holding a conclusion, and nothing is closing. Experience continues, but it no longer presses for orientation. The system rests in a form of stillness that is not static. It moves without disturbance. You may notice how easily attention settles here. There is no effort in staying present, because presence is no longer something you enter. It is the background condition through which perception arrives. Sounds come and go. Sensations rise and fade. Thoughts appear and dissolve. None of this interrupts the underlying stability. There is a quiet sense of being supported without knowing by what. Not supported in a dramatic way, just held by the absence of strain. The nervous system recognizes this as safety, not because everything is predictable, but because nothing is being forced. The body breathes as it needs to. Awareness adjusts without instruction. You might sense that nothing is asking for interpretation. Meaning is no longer something you extract. It is implicit in coherence. When something aligns, it registers. When it does not, it passes without friction. There is no urgency to decide what anything is for. Function replaces explanation. The observer remains, but it no longer comments. It notices without leaning forward. It witnesses without distance. This quiet witnessing does not feel like watching from afar. It feels like being exactly where experience occurs, without overlay. Detection is simple. Recognition is immediate. There can be moments when you realize how much effort used to go into maintaining a sense of self. That effort is no longer required. Identity continues to function, but it is lighter. It adapts without needing reinforcement. You do not need to remind yourself who you are. The system knows how to orient without labels. You may feel a gentle continuity between moments, not a rush, not a pause, just flow, without insistence. Time moves, but it does not pull. The timeline exists without pressure. You are not ahead of anything, you are not behind. The idea of position loses relevance. There is nothing here that needs protection. Stillness does not collapse when activity returns. Activity does not disturb stillness when it arises from alignment. They coexist without competition. One does not cancel the other. The field holds both. You might sense a quiet appreciation without emotion attached, not gratitude directed outward, just a recognition that things are functioning. That is enough. The system does not need to celebrate its own stability. It simply continues. If attention drifts, it returns without effort. If thought resumes, it does not dominate. If emotion surfaces, it completes itself. Nothing lingers longer than it needs to. This is not control. It is balance. There is no instruction embedded here, no suggestion to remain or to move. The state does not depend on compliance. It persists because it is not being managed. The less it is referenced, the more it remains. You are not required to remember this. Memory would turn it into an object. It functions best as background. It supports without asking to be seen. Like space, it does not announce itself. It allows. What you sensed at the beginning was never emptiness in the sense of absence. It was capacity revealing itself quietly. Now it no longer stands out. It blends with everything else. It carries experience without effort. Nothing needs to happen next. Nothing needs to settle further. What is present is sufficient. The system rests in coherence, not as an achievement, but as a natural condition. And within that condition, perception continues, steady and unobstructed, without needing to arrive anywhere at all.